Hello and welcome to Sophy Ridge on Sunday. After yesterday's very moving funeral for the Duke of Edinburgh, politics is slowly coming back into focus. A lobbying scandal that began with questions about texts from David Cameron to Rishi Sunak has since spread across Westminster. It's raised issues about access, conflicts of interest, and whether the current rules are tough enough. And all of this comes as voters across the UK prepare to head to the polls in less than 3 weeks. Well, on today's show, we'll be talking about those elections, the lobbying scandal and much more as well. The SNP leader, Nicola Sturgeon, will be joining us as she campaigns to win another term as Scotland's First Minister. I've spoken to the United States climate envoy, Kerry, ahead of a major summit next week. The Environment Secretary, Eustice, will be here in just a moment. We'll be asking him about lobbying, and we'll also be discussing that with Steve Reid, Labour's Shadow Community Secretary. Plus, I've investigated one of the tightest election races happening in England right now, one that matters an awful lot for both Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer. But first, David Cameron once said that lobbying would be Britain's next big scandal. It seems that that is one prediction that he got absolutely right. But the concerns about the former Prime Minister's own lobbying are just the tip of the iceberg, and the questions that it sparked go beyond him and throw into doubt whether the whole system that governs relationships between ministers and those in power is fit for purpose. Well, to discuss this, we're joined now by the government's Environment Secretary, Eustice. Thank you very much for being on the programme this morning, Mr Eustice. We'll talk about David Cameron in a moment, but just to talk about someone who is still very much a member of the government first, Matt Hancock. So he owns 15% of the shares in a firm called Topwood. Now, that's a company where his sister is a director. It's also approved as a supplier for the NHS. Is that really acceptable?
Well, of course, the reason we know about this is that Matt Hancock did exactly what all ministers would do in this case, which is to declare that interest. And so he did the right thing. He's declared that. He's had no role whatsoever in any procurement around this business. So, yes, there's nothing wrong with ministers having financial interests, provided they declare them in the appropriate way. And
so
provided
as long as you declare it, you can do whatever you want.
No,
is that how it works?
As long as you declare it and then have no role, obviously, in any procurement decisions around that company. That's the important thing here. The important thing is much more. How do ministers act and conduct themselves in these situations if there is a potential conflict? Well, the thing they should do is make sure they remove all of that conflict by ensuring they have no role whatsoever in decisions surrounding such companies. But secondly, declare it so there can be no perception that they might. And so he's done what you'd expect someone to do in that case.
You say there's no perception of a conflict of interest because he's declared it. You know, I'm not suggesting that Matt Hancock's broken the rules here. As you say, he's followed the rules. But some people looking at this might think that if a health secretary can own a sizable chunk of shares in a company run by his sister that is then a supplier for the department which he is the head of, then it's the rules themselves that are broken.
Well, I'm not sure, actually, that I would agree with that. Obviously, look, ministers can move around a lot. Famously, we tend not to spend, too long in one particular role. Sometimes a minister will be given a position and may have a long-standing financial interest that they therefore need to declare. I don't think that was the case in this one, but that is often the case. And so they declare it in the usual way and then remove themselves from any decisions that might affect their own, financial interests. And as far as I can, that's exactly what Matt Hancock did. I mean, the reason we know about this, the reason it's being talked about, is because he declared it and he did the right thing.
Yeah, he did declare it. I'm not saying that that's not what he did, but at the same time, can you not understand why some people looking at this might be thinking this looks pretty off? Shouldn't there be more distance in place? Shouldn't there be more rules in place to try and make sure that these conflicts of interest don't happen whether or not they're declared?
Well, look, there's a lot of different government inquiries. So the Prime Minister set up Nigel Boardman to look at the Greensill case in particular. There's then...
That's not looking at the Matt Hancock case, though, is it?
No, it won't, but there's also Simon Greensill's looking at the issue of civil servants potentially having second jobs to make sure that there's no conflicts there. And of course, then there are several parliamentary committees looking at this. I think the right thing to do is for these reviews to go through their process, to conclude, to work out exactly what did and did not happen. And then, yes, of course, there may come a time after that, when it's right to consider tweaks to policy. But fundamentally, I think that the systems we have in place with ministers declaring interest, with the ministerial code, and the focus on that and how ministers conduct themselves in office is actually a pretty good one. But that's not to say that you couldn't make tweaks or changes. And obviously, there'll be a time and a place for that after these reviews have concluded.
Let's talk about the Boardman review, shall we? Because I understand that it is quite helpful for when ministers like yourself do these rounds, that you can point towards the fact that the Boardman review has been set up. At the same time, though, it's got no power to sanction, no statutory or legal force, and it's strictly limited to looking at the Greensill affair. I mean, it sounds a bit toothless, doesn't it?
Well, no, I think it's actually the right thing to do, because the worst thing for ministers is to say that they think everything's OK, and then suddenly it turns out that there are other details that emerge. And so the Prime Minister, I think quite rightly, has said, let's get to the bottom of this. Let's have a legal professional who's a non-executive director at the Cabinet Office to really look at this and scrutinise it in detail.
But don't they need more powers? This is the point I'm getting at. Doesn't this review need more powers if it's going to be taken seriously? Well,
I don't think it needs powers. I think what it needs to do is to get to the bottom of what happened. And then, as I said, following that, if there's a general view in Parliament that the rules around declaration of ministers' interests could be changed slightly, or if there's a view that rules around what ministers can do when they leave office should be changed slightly, well, then that's a policy decision, and that's something that can be taken at the point. But this review doesn't need enforcement powers as such. It just needs to get to the bottom of what's happened. So
will you implement what the review recommends then?
Well, the review is going to establish what happened in this particular case.
I know what the review is going to do, but will you commit to implementing what the review recommends?
I don't think the review is going to make policy recommendations, but of course there are other reviews going on in Parliament.
What's the point of it then? If it has no powers, it's not going to make policy recommendations. What's the point of it?
Well, because people are raising questions about what happened in this particular instance around Greensill, both because there was a civil servant, Bill Crothers, who at one point was working for the civil service and had a role in Greensill. So that is something that's being looked at. And obviously there's been a lot of questions raised about David Cameron's contacts with ministers. So the purpose of the review is to answer the questions that people are asking. But it's not really there to prescribe policy. So there are other parliamentary committees that are looking at this issue in the round, and I'm sure many of them will make recommendations on policy. And of course, government will always look very carefully at what Parliament recommends in this space.
Let's talk about David Cameron. Are you comfortable with the way the former Prime Minister has acted?
Well, look, he himself has said that, with hindsight, probably would have been better if, rather than texting ministers, if he had instead written letters to set out his views more formally. But I think the real point is, has he done anything wrong? Well, on the face of it, no. But there's a review that's going on. We mustn't prejudge that.
So you don't think he's done anything wrong?
Well, look, there are rules that say the limit what a former minister or former prime minister can do for a period of 2 years. He meticulously observed those. Yes, he then took roles after that.
Did he exploit the rules? This is the thing. It's like, do you think that he took advantage of rules that many think were just too lax?
Well, I don't think he took advantage of any rules. No, he meticulously observed the rules there that he himself actually put in place after some concerns around lobbying a decade ago. He put in place these restrictions on what ministers can do for a period of 2 years. But look, he himself has conceded that, with hindsight, if he had his time again, he wouldn't have texted Rishi Sunak and wouldn't have texted others. He would instead have written through formal channels. But the big question is, what did then Rishi Sunak do, having been approached? The answer is, he asked the question, asked people to look at this issue. The answer came back that there was nothing that could be done for this company. The company was told, we're not going to do anything at all to help you, and the company went bust. So at the end of the day, did people give any special favours to David Cameron or indeed to Greensill? The answer to that's no.
You worked quite closely with David Cameron when you were press secretary for him when he was leader of the opposition. Given what you know about David Cameron, do you think that he's acted in a sort of calculated way here? Or do you think, frankly, he's just been a bit of an idiot?
Well, I wouldn't ascribe to either of those definitions. I think, look, he abided by the rules that he himself put in place, and so didn't take any roles for the period of 2 years after leaving office. He's been out of office 5 years now, and he left office when he was still quite young, and that's often the case now with prime ministers. And you can't begrudge people a chance to do a different career and something different after they've left that top job. I think everybody would accept that. But look, in terms of did he do anything wrong? Well, look, he himself conceded that the manner in which he approached Rishi Sunak on this particular issue on behalf of a company that he was working for by text probably was ill-advised, and probably he should have done it through a more formal route with a letter through his private office. David Cameron himself conceded that, and that he would do things differently if he had his time again.
OK. Keen to move on now to COVID. NHS providers warning this morning that it could take 5 years to clear the backlog caused by the pandemic. How concerned are you?
Well, look, this is obviously an important issue. It's been a huge endeavour that the NHS have been through to try to deal with COVID. We've tried, apart from those peak periods, the government has really tried to encourage people with other routine operations to keep coming in when they're able to, when the NHS hasn't been at those peak periods. Obviously, people have been anxious at times, and obviously at times when the NHS has been particularly stressed, they found it less easy to take forward those other operations. But I know that this will be very high on Matt Hancock's agenda as we emerge from the pandemic, making sure that we can get on top of those routine operations that are obviously so important and that have life consequences themselves.
Another issue that many people are worried about at the minute is the emergence of these new variants. We know about this variant first discovered in India. Lots of work being done to try and track exactly how much of a foothold it has in the UK. Have you got the most up-to-date figures on how many cases there are?
The last I think I saw, there were around 70 cases, but I think I've seen lots of different numbers on different variants. You'll appreciate there's quite a few. So it's a fairly small number at the moment, but it is something that we are watching. Then I'm told that there's no evidence at the moment that this particular variant is able to get around the vaccine, for instance, or indeed that it's necessarily more contagious than the others. But we are looking at it. It will be studied. We've got some of the best genomic studies available in this country. We're very good at genome sequencing for different variants, and that work is ongoing. And obviously there's a wider concern here. The biggest threat to everything that we're doing at the moment is that at some point there will be a variant that manages to evade the vaccine or largely evade it. So it is high on our concerns, which is why, the vaccine rollout's been incredibly successful with over 60% of the adult population now vaccinated. We continue to proceed with some caution as we come out of lockdown.
I'm interested to know why India isn't currently on the UK's red list. This is the list of companies where you're either banned from coming into the country or you have to quarantine for 10 days in a hotel. So at the minute in India, there are over 10,000 COVID cases per million people. If you compare that to 3,000 in Pakistan, just over 4,000 in Bangladesh. Pakistan and Bangladesh are on the red list, but India isn't. Can you reassure me that this is science, not politics at play here, given the Prime Minister's planning a trip to India?
Yes. So we have an expert committee that looks at this and then makes recommendations to the Transport Secretary and Matt Hancock and the group that make up the COVID Cabinet subcommittee. They look very closely at it, and it's then discussed more widely. It is reviewed periodically, so roughly every 10 days or so they look at this. If there's a need to do something urgently, they can do that, but they do periodically review variants that are in other countries and the approach that we should take. We should bear in mind that everybody coming here needs to get a pre-departure test and also tests after arrival. So that's an approach that we take now. But for those red list countries, obviously, quarantine's also required. And I know they're looking at reviewing this to have a sort of green, amber and red approach to triage things more, because international travel is going to become a more important focal point as we come out of lockdown.
Is it really a good idea for the Prime Minister to be going to India later this month when we know that COVID cases there are surging. I know there's a Brexit trade deal potentially riding on this trip, but surely public health has got to come first.
Public health does come first, but that doesn't mean that there should be no visits at all for business purposes. And so, yes, it's already the case. People can't go on holiday. They can't travel at all on holiday. But for something like this, I think, yes, it is appropriate. But look, absolutely, measures will be taken to ensure that the visit is COVID secure, that any staff and the entourage attending with the Prime Minister will obviously be in a COVID secure environment. Extra precautions will be taken. But I think it is important that the business and the business of politics, if you like, does continue and doesn't stop completely. We just need to make sure we take the right precautions.
Just finally, the UK is hosting the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow in November. Big deal. Know how huge, of course, climate change is globally, but also for this government as well. Some are saying it should be done remotely. How committed are you to make sure it's done in person?
Well, we think it should be done in person, physically. I mean, these are there is a COP secretariat or a COP bureau that ultimately makes these final decisions, but they do so in a really very close cooperation with the host country. We delayed it, obviously, last year because we wanted it to happen in person. I think it's much more effective if it does happen in person. That's absolutely our intention. There may be components of it that are part virtual, that some people attend virtually, but we think for the main Leaders' Summit, we should try and make sure that it happens in person, and that's our intention.
OK, thank you very much for coming on the programme this morning, George Eustice.
Thank you.
Well, we were just talking there about climate change, and next week the US President Joe Biden is going to be hosting another major summit of world leaders to discuss the issue. His special envoy on climate, the former Secretary of State John Kerry, this week became the first Biden administration official to travel to China. Now, before he made that trip, I spoke to him and began by asking how urgent it is that the world takes action on climate change.
Well, it's extremely urgent. I mean, the word urgent is totally applicable to the current crisis that we're in because countries are simply not getting the job done. Even if we did everything that we set out to do in the Paris Agreement, the Earth's temperature is going to increase a very significant amount, perhaps as much as 3.7 degrees or more. And the reason for the real urgency now is that because we're not getting done what we said we'd do in Paris, it's actually heading towards 4 degrees or more. That's beyond catastrophic in the consequences to food production, water, habitability in various parts of the planet, the melting of ice, the sea level rise, the warming, all the consequences. So we have an opportunity to get on track. The United States has a summit next week. President Biden is hosting. And we will be setting forth our plan to try to do our part. And we hope to raise ambition among all nations over the course of these next months.
As you say, at the Earth Day summit, President Biden is expected to tell us what the US's emissions targets are. Given the fact that you're the second biggest emitter in the world and that you haven't even been in the Paris Agreement in recent years, is it not the US's duty to actually set the most ambitious targets in the world?
Well, it's the U.S.'s duty, certainly, to return to the Paris Agreement, as President Biden has done, and to work with other nations to do the maximum amount possible. I can assure you that the United States will do its part to help keep us on track to have a 1.5 degree rise, the limit. That's our goal. And then to head to 2050, where we would be net zero. And we hope that other nations will join us to raise the ambition to be able to hold that 1.5 degree limit on the increase of Earth's temperature. Obviously, to do that, we're all going to have to do our part. I mean, yes, we are number 2 in the world in emissions. And we helped to put the Paris Agreement together, and now we're going to do everything in our power to help get Glasgow to do what it needs to do to put the world on a track in these next 10 years to accomplish our goal. But the simple reality is no one nation does this alone. Even if the United States went to zero tomorrow, or the UK did, or Europe, the fact is that China, which is almost 30% of the world's emissions, other countries, India, Russia, Indonesia, Japan, there are a lot of industrialized countries that are contributing to this challenge. 20 nations, all of whom are invited to President Biden's summit, are responsible for about 81% of all the emissions. So to solve this problem, those 20 countries have to lead the way. We recognize that responsibility. We are very sorry for the last 4 years with the president who didn't care about science and who didn't have a real rationale for pulling out, but he was the only president in the world, the only leader in the world who pulled out of this agreement. President Biden said the first thing you do as president is return. We've done that. And now with this summit, we're going to try and bring nations to the table to do what we need to do to get the job done for future generations.
Of course, there's a responsibility, as you say, on everyone, but particularly those countries that make up 80% of emissions. At the same time, the US is responsible for up to 15% of emissions. China is responsible for 30%. Some of our viewers might be thinking, is it really going to make a difference if people in the UK eat less meat or cycle more when you consider these colossal emissions coming out of the US and China?
Of course it makes a difference, because every country has to join this effort. As I said a moment ago, no one country, no one entity like the EU can solve the problem. This is an unbelievable monument, the climate crisis, to the need for multilateralism. This is why we have a UN. This is why we bring nations together. And unfortunately, the United States became a renegade in the last 4 years under the non-leadership of President Trump. But we are now back and present with a very aggressive series of initiatives in order to try to make up for lost time. We need to address this challenge. And the beauty of it is this creates jobs. In the addressing of this, in the deployment of solar, of wind, in the further explorations with respect to hydrogen, fuel, in the creation perhaps of storage or longer-term batteries, these are all jobs. You make electric vehicles, you have people who are going to make them. I mean, this is the biggest economic opportunity the world has seen since the Industrial Revolution.
Nearly a third of the world's emissions come from China. You are planning to travel to China this week to discuss climate issues.
We have been in touch with China. I've talked to my counterpart a number of times. We recognize that China, nearly 30% of the world's emissions, is essential to resolving this crisis. And our hopes are that China is prepared to assume responsibility as we are and as other nations are. This is not a moment where any nation can not step up to raise the ambition that Paris envisioned. And what we're doing now is not something that we've instigated particularly. It's the automatic follow-on to the Paris Agreement, that we would reconvene, we will take stock of where we are. There's a formal take stock in 3 years, but already the UN agency responsible for making judgments about the science, the IPCC, has told us 2 years ago that we have about 12 years within which to make the most critical decisions to reduce the most damaging impacts of climate. We're now 2 years down the road. We haven't done that yet. We have, 9 years, 8 years to make those decisions, and that's what Glasgow is about. It's a moment when we all come together from around the world and we commit to do more.
There are, of course, pretty big disagreements between the US and China on trade. Also, you've described the treatment of the Uyghur Muslims as a genocide. Can you really have a productive conversation with China about climate change?
Absolutely, of course we can. Climate change is about the survival of the planet. Every nation has a stake in the outcome of the climate issue. And big, powerful nations, historically, have proven that they have the ability to be able to discuss difficult issues even as they disagree on them. Okay. When I was Secretary of State, we dealt very directly with Russia even after we had sanctioned them for the invasion of Crimea and Ukraine. We continued to have tough conversations about that, even as we made progress on the Iran nuclear agreement, on the Paris Agreement, on other environment issues. So yes, President Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev met at Reykjavik and lowered the number of nuclear weapons pointing at each other, despite the fact Reagan thought the Soviet Union was the evil empire. We can have those conversations, and that is the real stuff of diplomacy. That's what you have to do, is try, the failure of diplomacy is war, and the object of the diplomacy is to avoid that.
I am keen to ask you about the protests that we've seen in Minneapolis after another black man shot by police. Of course, it comes after the killing of George Floyd, which sparked protests around the world. What's your reaction to what we've seen?
Well, obviously, we're living through a very painful moment in our country with respect to race and policing and the challenges of keeping communities whole and together. We've had a terrible history, unfortunately, of police stops and of relationship with African Americans particularly, but with racial overtones for a long period of time. And we need to get beyond it. That's one of President Biden's real missions that he has taken on, is to heal America and bring America back together. But at the same time, as I say that, and people are angry and frustrated at the deaths of people at the hands of really incomprehensible situations, nevertheless, we also cannot condone or accept the fact that the legitimate protest to that is go out and loot a Walmart or destroy property. Protest is protest, and it's important that that protest be nonviolent. Otherwise, you begin confusing everything and losing the importance of the message that you have. But these are serious challenges, and I used to be a prosecutor. I know how difficult policing is, but at the same time, I also know the lives that young African Americans particularly have led in our country, being stopped in places and for circumstances that no white person would be stopped in. And so we have to meet that challenge. We've got some tough conversations to have and some actions to take.
One last quick question to squeeze in, because I know it's something that we talk about an awful lot in the UK, analysing that relationship between the UK Prime Minister and the US President. How would you describe the relationship between Joe Biden and Boris Johnson?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, they are friends and get along well, and we're working together on a lot of key issues that matter to both of us. So I have no knowledge of anything else.
My interview with John Kerry there. And Sky News has also launched the first daily programme dedicated to climate issues. Do check that one out. It's presented by my colleague Anna Jones. You can catch it every weekday at 6:30 and 9:30 in the evening. Now let's return to the lobbying scandal that's currently front and centre here in Westminster. We're joined now by Labour's Shadow Community Secretary, Steve Reid. Thanks very much for being in the studio with us today. We heard earlier in the programme from George Eustice, who said that it's right for all of these questions to be looked at. He did say on the face of it that David Cameron didn't do anything wrong and that the system in many ways is actually a pretty good one. Do you agree with him?
Well, I think what we're seeing in all of this is that the era of Tory sleaze is well and truly back. And what's happened with the Greensill scandal is really quite shocking. You've got a former Prime Minister employed by a wealthy organisation who is then using his personal relationships with existing ministers, including the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and persuading them to do favours that would not have been open to other businesses or organisations.
They didn't do the favours, did they? He didn't manage to persuade them to do the favours. They were rejected for the COVID
Well, we don't
loans.
entirely know, do we? Because Greensill did get access. Greensill did get access to the framework loan schemes, and it's not entirely clear how they got access to that. They were one of only 2 unregulated banks that were treated in that way. We don't know whether that was as a result of the lobbying that David Cameron was doing. Now, what we've seen so far is a couple of texts exchanged between Rishi Sunak and David Cameron. In one of those, the Chancellor says that he will push officials hard to do favours for Greensill. That of itself may be a breach of the ministerial code, and that of itself needs to be investigated, because ministers should be acting in a way that is impartial and they should be pushing things directly onto their officials when this happens. But we haven't seen all the texts or the secret phone calls that went on between David Cameron and Rishi Sunak, and we really need to in order to understand exactly what's going on. We can't just dismiss this in the way that Mr Eustice tried to do earlier this morning on your show.
So what I'm interested in, because I think it's very easy for Labour to throw around words like cronyism, like Tory sleaze, as you did. What exactly do you want to happen? Well, what needs to change?
What we've been calling for is a open parliamentary investigation into exactly what's been going on.
So we've got lots of investigations, haven't we?
But we need an open...
What do you want to actually happen? What needs to change in the rules?
This hasn't just started with Greensill. So a year ago in the House of Commons, when we had Robert Jenrick, the Communities Secretary, involved in the West Ferry scandal, he admitted he had broken the law to do favours for a billionaire Tory party donor and helped him dodge £40 billion in tax.
But the way to get around this, and I appreciate that there's lots of concerns over lobbying, about access, what needs to change?
Well, one of the things that needs to change, and I'll use that example if I can, Sophie, because I wrote to the Cabinet Secretary asking for an inquiry into Mr Jenrick to see whether he had broken the ministerial code. The Prime Minister blocked it. So the inquiry didn't happen. And what seems to be going on here is that we've got the Greensill case, the examples with Matt Hancock, the examples with West Ferry and Robert Jenrick. In every case, Number 10 blocks the investigations from going on.
There's lots of investigations,
so we need,
aren't there? It's like 8.
Well, they're trying to mark their own homework. The man that they've put in charge of the Greensill investigation, Nigel Boardman, is on the board of a bank with very close links to the Conservative.
But there's an awful lot of other inquiries going on already. It feels to me like the problem isn't that we haven't got enough inquiries. We've got loads of inquiries. The problem is no one seems to know what should actually change to clean up
what
politics.
We need is an open inquiry, not one where the Conservatives are marking their own homework. Because Boris Johnson has shown repeatedly over the past year he's not interested in exposing what's going wrong, and he's not interested in stopping what's going wrong. If we have an independent parliamentary inquiry into what's going on, open and transparent, and in David Cameron's own words, sunlight is the best disinfectant. Well, let's expose this whole situation to that sunlight. Let's see exactly what's going on. Let's pull in everybody to public hearings that the public can see as well as MPs, and let's find out what's going on, and then let's put in place the measures that will prevent it from recurring. One of them might well be that the Prime Minister should not be the person who decides whether there are investigations into his own ministers for breaches of the ministerial code. Perhaps an independent person should be doing that so that the Prime Minister can't then be accused of covering up wrongdoing by his own ministers.
Is there an argument that Labour would be just the same as this if you were in power? If you look at the evidence, right, if you look at this, for example, David Evans' story in the newspaper today, Labour's General Secretary won a series of taxpayer contracts from Croydon Council. Labour won council, deputy leader happens to be the mother of his child. Is this evidence that if Labour gets a chance, they would do exactly the same thing? It's just that the fact that you're so far away from power for so long, the companies aren't paying for the influence.
I saw that the Conservatives had put this out, and if that's the best they can do to try and deflect from what they're doing, then it's a pretty miserable attempt.
OK, how about this then?
What David was doing, it was an open and transparent procurement process, which is the polar opposite of what's been going on with Greensill or the company that Matt Hancock has shares in that he failed to declare, that's been winning millions of pounds in contracts from the NHS.
He did declare it. That's exactly the point. He did declare it.
He didn't declare that his family had shares in this company that's been winning millions of pounds in contracts from the NHS.
But did the rules oblige him to do that? He declared it in exactly the way that he was obliged to.
I don't think he did, and that's why we need an investigation into that as well. It's repeatedly happening with minister after minister after
minister. Greensill then. The Shadow Defence Secretary John Healey also lobbied the government to allow Greensill access to COVID loans. He says it was the right thing to do because he was trying to protect a steel plant in his constituency. Presumably, David Cameron thought it was the right thing to do as well. It's just that he happened to have better access to ministers than John Healey did.
Constituency MPs are asked to act on behalf of businesses in their constituencies, and as constituency MPs, that's part of the job. David Cameron is not an MP. David Cameron was being employed by Greensill directly and being paid to try and get them preferential treatment from the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who was a friend of his, whose number he had on WhatsApp. An MP acting for a local business is a million miles away from what's been going on with this situation. And I really am afraid, the kind of behaviour we've been seeing from this government is not the behaviour you would expect of an advanced Western democracy. It's what you would associate with a tin pot dictatorship. And Britain deserves an awful lot better than that. We have to shine a light on the sleaze that is corroding the heart of this government so we can stop it and get back to the kind of government that the British people can have trust in. OK,
I'm keen to ask you a couple more things about COVID while I have you as well. Now, NHS providers are very worried about the backlog in the NHS caused by the pandemic. They said it could be 5 years to clear. How concerning is that?
Well, it's incredibly concerning. I've had constituents coming to me now that have had very urgent operations for things like cancer delayed by months. Now, frankly, if you've got cancer, you can't afford to wait for months. I mean, part of the problem here is that the NHS had already been underfunded by the time we went into this pandemic. The pandemic was always going to make it more difficult, but we really need now to be looking at everything that can be done to make sure that people that have urgent treatment needed in the NHS can go ahead and get it. And one way to do that is to make sure that we keep a lid on the situation with COVID right now. So we have to keep rolling out the vaccination programme, but also we need to do much better with contact tracing and testing once we get out of this initial period, because new variants of the disease are coming out and we need to identify them and crack down on them quickly. Third thing we need to do is keep control of the borders. So the government still does not have a comprehensive quarantine programme for people coming into the country.
Should David Cameron still be going to... David Cameron as a slip. Should Boris Johnson still be going to India, given that?
I think he shouldn't be. No, I mean, there are new variants emerging all around the world. The government is telling people don't travel if you don't have to absolutely travel. I can't see why the Prime Minister can't conduct his business with the Indian government by Zoom. So many of us do that these days. And I think the Prime Minister, all of us in public life, need to try and set an example. I'd much rather the Prime Minister did it by Zoom than travelling to India.
Just finally, YouGov poll this week gave the Conservatives a 14-point lead over Labour. Now, I know it's just one poll, but you've got elections in just a few weeks' time and it feels like the polls are going in the wrong direction. At what point do you start to panic?
It's just one poll. Let's wait and see what happens in the elections. They're only a few weeks away. After I've finished in your studio, I'm off door knocking in Nottinghamshire with my colleagues, so I'm going to hear what the voters have got to say and we'll see on the 6th of May what they think.
OK, thank you very much for coming on the show today. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Well, we just mentioned the local elections there, and there are hundreds of races happening across the UK at the moment. But politically, some contests matter more to Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer than others. Well, this week we've been looking at one of those races, the fight to be the next mayor of the West Midlands. In the May 6th local election bonanza, this is the place to watch if you want to find out if Labour has a fighting chance against the Conservatives in England. Last time around, Labour's red wall was breached when Tory candidate and former John Lewis boss Andy Street won the race to be mayor of the West Midlands. Now Liam Byrne must prove that Labour can win back those disaffected voters.
I think most people in the Labour movement know that the race in the West Midlands is probably the most important race this year that Labour contends. You know, the defeat that we had in December 2019 was really significant, and a lot of people actually in the media and elsewhere have underestimated quite the depth of that defeat.
There's been some criticism about Keir Starmer's leadership, about people not knowing what he stands for. Do you think that's fair?
When we take Keir out and about in the West Midlands, we try and walk him through markets and that kind of thing, there's a real enthusiasm to actually, come over, have a chat, listen, talk, share some views. He's clever. He's intelligent and he's straightforward. Anybody who's kind of watching Prime Minister's questions and just watching the forensic way he takes apart Boris the blusterer, people just sort of respect that.
At the same time, though, you're obviously critical of Boris Johnson, but he did manage to take 6 seats off Labour at the last election in 2019 in your area. It feels like people in the West Midlands might quite like the idea of Boris Johnson as well.
I spent more time on the streets of the West Midlands during that election than pretty much any other politician in our region. And I can tell you overwhelmingly what people talked about was Brexit and Jeremy Corbyn. And even amongst many Tories I met, people who said, they'd always been voting Tory, you tended to find people say, well, we do kind of think that it's time for a change. I'm afraid we don't like Mr. Corbyn. And people would often describe Boris as a bit of a clown, and so they weren't in love with that. They did want to get Brexit done, and the truth was they didn't trust our leader at the time.
You should beat Andy Street easily then. Is that what you're anticipating?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I mean, obviously it's difficult when you don't have polls. We found door knocking has gone really well. People are quite keen. People are quite pleased to see us kind of turn up, and our numbers coming back look great. So yeah, we'll do well.
What do you think the main issues are that you're fighting on in the West Midlands?
The number one issue by a mile is jobs, jobs, jobs. People are super worried about the economy, the livelihoods of small business, and basically how we get back on our feet as fast as possible.
The Conservative Party candidate is duly elected as Mayor for the West Midlands Combined Authority.
Andy Street, who narrowly won the 2017 election to become the region's first mayor, agrees that recovery from coronavirus needs to be the priority.
So I think there's one overwhelming issue, Sophie, and that's how we're going to bounce back from the pandemic. So obviously this was a region that was performing very well before the pandemic, but we've had a horrible swipe left from the pandemic, lots of job losses. So the big question is, who is going to lead the economic recovery of this region?
This contest is also going to be looked through the prism of Boris Johnson versus Keir Starmer as well. You know, it's a region that is a key electoral battleground for both parties. Both Labour and the Conservatives really need to win it, frankly. The Conservatives obviously did better in 2019. How do you think Keir Starmer goes down in the Red Wall then?
I'm waiting to see the answer to that. This election will tell us something about that. What I hope it will tell us is actually the idea that we did very well in the Red Wall on the back of Brexit and the feeling about Jeremy Corbyn, and that was about it. I think we will prove that's wrong. I think what's going to be proved is that support for the Conservative Party in the areas that we describe as the Red Wall is actually about something much, much deeper. And primarily, it's about local Conservatives, whether they be MPs, mayors or local councils, really delivering for people. And if you think of the investment that's come into the Black Country, come into Northfield, the only seat that we won in Birmingham, come into these areas, there is clear evidence that Conservatives deliver for the areas that arguably have been left behind. That's what it's really all about.
I've just spoke to Liam Byrne before talking to you. I have to say, he seemed pretty confident. He seemed to think that he was going to win quite comfortably. Are you worried?
I don't think anyone's going to win comfortably. I think it's going to be very, very close race. The last mayoral race was very close. The general election was very close here. So I'm prepared to predict it'll be close again. And I'm actually quite surprised that he was confident, because I think, and the feedback I get, is that it's really, really contested. We are confident of our position, but no, it's going to be very, very close in the end.
To give a sense of how close this race could be, there are 28 Westminster constituencies across the region that the West Midlands Mayor controls. In the last general election in 2019, 14 of them were won by the Conservative Party. The other 14 were won by Labour. Nearly 1.2 million votes were cast, but there was less than 3,000 votes between the two main parties. And the West Midlands was part of a wider story. 6 previously Labour seats, some of which had been held by the party for decades, turned blue as Boris Johnson ate into the so-called Red Wall. And it's this that gives the West Midlands race an added significance. It will be an indicator of how far Boris Johnson has kept those Red Wall voters on side, and a test of Keir Starmer's ability to win them back to Labour.
It will be a setback for the government if they don't hold this. Everything suggests it's going to be tight. It was tight last time round when Andy Street managed this surprise victory. You've got really factors on either side that are quite hard to calculate. On his side, he's very popular for his business background, for the John Lewis history that he has, for the real efforts that he's made to improve the area. But he's been quite quiet. He's a reserved personality. And he's had what you might say as a handicap during the pandemic of coming from the same party as the government. That's not a problem that has affected Labour mayors. I think it is the kind of place where Keir Starmer has to show that he's getting through to people, that he's got something to say.
The race for the West Midlands is unusually seen as a must-win for both parties. Whatever happens on the 6th of May, it's likely to be very close. That's my piece from the West Midlands there. And let's now take a quick look at the full list of candidates who are standing to be the region's mayor. Liam Byrne is standing for Labour, Steve Caldwell for the Green Party, Pete Durnell for Reform UK, Andy Street for the Conservatives and Jenny Wilkinson for the Liberal Democrats. Those are the candidates there to be the mayor of the West Midlands. Well, that's one of the key races in England, but of course a huge election is also taking place in Scotland. The SNP fighting to win a majority, not only to keep them in power, but to secure a mandate for a second independence referendum. Their leader, Nicola Sturgeon, joins us now from Glasgow. Thank you very much for being with us, Ms Sturgeon. Before we talk about the election, I just want to ask you very quickly about COVID. In Scotland, the decision was taken to speed up the easing of lockdown. There are, though, these concerns about a new variant first identified in India. How concerned are you, and are you prepared to slow things down again if necessary?
Well, if necessary, of course, we have to do that, but I fervently hope it won't be necessary. We're making good progress here. Case numbers are falling. The vaccination rollout is going exceptionally well. But the big risk we face, not just in Scotland, but across the UK right now, is the importation of new variants of the virus, variants that might be faster spreading, that might be more severe, and crucially, variants that might undermine the efficacy of the vaccine. So we've got to be very careful about that, which is why I think one of the restrictions we're all going to have to live with for longer is a restriction on international travel. In Scotland, we insist that people quarantine in managed isolation wherever in the world they come to if they come directly into Scotland. And we continue to try to persuade the UK government to take a similar approach, because we mustn't allow the progress we're making domestically to be undermined by too lax a position on international travel. It's very difficult for the sector, and it's really important that governments support it as we try to continue to protect ourselves against the virus.
We spoke to George Eustice a bit earlier on the programme. He said that at the moment there doesn't seem to be evidence that the variant first found in India is more contagious or that it evades the vaccine. Is that your understanding as well?
So far, that would be my understanding. It is at the moment a variant of interest as opposed to a variant of concern. But I think the thing we've got to recognise about COVID is that it is mutating and we're seeing new variants appear in different parts of the world. The variant, of course, that has caused us in Scotland and other parts of the UK the most problem over the last few months is the Kent variant, the one that led us all into lockdown again over Christmas and into the early part of this year. So we don't know where the variants of real concern are going to come from, which is why an approach to international travel that tries to categorise risk, with some countries categorised as red list countries and other countries deemed to be safer, I think poses a risk, because none of us know right now where the next variant that might be really problematic is going to occur, which is why, unfortunately, and I take no pleasure in saying this because it's really difficult for the aviation sector, airports, tourism, we've got to be very careful as we continue to suppress things at home. We've got to be careful we don't allow it to be reseeded with more dangerous variants from elsewhere. I mean, if I look back to last summer, the later part of last summer, as we came out of the first lockdown, we almost eliminated the strains that were circulating within Scotland here, but we probably opened up international travel too quickly. So we allowed the virus to reseed into our domestic population. And I think it's important we try as hard as we can to avoid that in the weeks and months ahead.
The importance of learning the lessons from the previous year. I'm keen to talk now a bit about your domestic record ahead of the all-important elections coming up in May, and specifically just to start on education. So in 2015, before the last election, you said, "My priority as First Minister, and let me be clear, I want to be judged on this, is that every young person should have the same advantage that I had growing up." Now, research from Glasgow University last year found what it describes as staggering inequality in Scotland's schools. Pupils who live in the most deprived fifth of communities are just as likely to leave school with just one hire as students in the most prosperous fifth leave with 5. So does every child in Scotland have the same advantages as you had growing up?
Not yet. I think we've still got work to do, but more of those young people have greater advantages now than was the case 5 years ago. And let me be clear, I will be judged on this, as I will be judged on everything in just a couple of weeks' time at the election. If you take the attainment gap in particular, and I know the qualification system is different in Scotland to other parts of the UK, so apologies if I'm about to use terminology that not everybody will understand, but at what we call level 5, which is our national fives, the attainment gap has reduced by a third. At level 6, which is our hires, it has reduced by a fifth. There's work to do. We've expanded dramatically early years education, which everybody accepts is the biggest investment you can make in reducing the attainment gap later in a young person's school education. And we also have now, and this is something that's important to me as somebody who was the first person in my family to go to university, we now have record numbers of people from poorer, more deprived communities going into higher education. So we've made significant progress, but we still got work to do. We would undoubtedly have made more progress had we not faced the disruption as everybody has faced over the past year with COVID. So there remains a lot of work to do. And one of the reasons I'm asking people to re-elect me as First Minister, the SNP as government, is so that we can get on with that job. We're probably the only party in this election that is putting a serious plan for government before the Scottish people.
You can't blame this all on the pandemic, though.
I didn't.
If you look at the...
I didn't.
But if you look at the statistics from before the pandemic, for example, the pass rate for higher exams gone down over the last 4 years, 79% in 2015, 75% now. I mean, that's happening on your watch, isn't it?
Sorry, just to be clear, Sophie, I think people listening to me would not have heard me try to blame everything on COVID. Equally, I think most people understand that COVID has an impact on every aspect of our life. But if you look across the last 5 years at all of the statistics, what you see in Scotland is increasing attainment. So young people coming out of school with more qualifications and the attainment gap reducing, and more young people, particularly from deprived communities, going into university and indeed going on to positive destinations overall. I am not going to sit here and say that it is job done. I think there is more to do, nor am I going to apologise for setting big ambitions and saying to people, judge me on the record of my government overall. People will make a balanced judgment on whether they think the SNP has a good record in government, and the evidence suggests that people don't think we're perfect, but people think we're the party to be trusted with taking Scotland forward. And they'll look at the other parties as well. One of the interesting features of the Scottish election is that the other parties are all vying to be leader of the opposition. In these really serious times, Scotland deserves a party that is serious about government, serious about facing up to the challenges of government, leading us through the crisis and into recovery. And that's what I and the SNP offer.
OK, is the SNP a party that is serious about funding the NHS? Because this week you promised a transformational increase in NHS funding. The IFS says that actually the rise is less than the rise planned for England and is actually unlikely to keep up with demand. So is the rhetoric better than the reality here?
Can I come on to that in a moment? Because I want to take that on directly, and I think it's wrong. But, this is one area where I don't need to ask people to judge me on what I'm promising for the future. Judge me on the past. So at the last Scottish election, I made a commitment that we would increase funding in the National Health Service by £500 million in real terms. In reality, we've done 3 times that. The NHS budget over the past 5 years has increased by £1.8 billion in real terms. So, you don't have to look at my commitments.
What you're promising now, and you promised a transformational increase in NHS funding. The IFS say this works out as an annual rise of 2.1% above inflation. In England, it's 3.4%.
Can I come on to that point? But I actually think it is legitimate to say to people, look, you have pitched these questions at look at my record. So I'm pointing to the record where we actually exceeded the commitment we made. But on that point, the IFS have looked at the position. So there's 2 points to make here. The IFS have looked at the position in England up to 2023. That's the only the time frame in which the UK government have made a commitment in England. The commitment I've made for the next Parliament takes us up to 2026. So it's apples and pears to make the comparison that you have made. But the other point, and this is a key point, is that in a sense the commitment I have made is a backstop. Whatever the budgetary position that the UK government delivers for Scotland, we will deliver that transformational 20% increase in health funding. But if the UK government exceeds that and there is extra money comes through the Barnett formula, we will commit that to the NHS as well. So by definition, we cannot be spending less than the UK government does in England, because the commitment we've made is the backstop. And if the Barnett formula allows us to go further, we will go further. But, we we exceeded our commitment at the last election, and we will deliver this commitment at least over the next Parliament, a 20% increase in NHS funding, which amounts to £2.5 billion. Extra money for social care over and above that, which the IFS analysis also doesn't take into account, and also shifting the balance of investment so that much more is going into community health care and mental health care too.
OK, another area I'm keen to talk about as well is drugs. Scotland suffers more drug deaths per capita than any other European country, over 1,200 people dying of drug misuse last year. That's a record high for the 6th year in a row. How is that acceptable?
It's not, and I've been very candid about that. We have tried to tackle the drugs deaths, but we can't look at the figures for the numbers of people dying and conclude that what we have done has been enough or has been effective enough. So over the past few months, we've done a number of things to make a concerted attempt to turn this around. So firstly, I have appointed a dedicated minister with responsibility for this, reporting directly to me. We have set aside a budget over the next few years of £250 million to specifically support initiatives to tackle the drugs crisis and drugs deaths, and that is supporting more community work. It is supporting greater provision of rehabilitation beds, including residential rehabilitation and aftercare support, faster access to treatment so that if somebody comes forward looking for treatment, they get that quickly and aren't having to wait for that. So there is a whole package of policies and interventions now that we are taking forward to turn it around, because to be frank, it's not acceptable. And you know, you can make choices as a politician. You can be confronted with something like that and try to dig your heels in and defend the indefensible, or you can do what I think is better and admit that this is an area where we have not done well enough and we're determined to do better in future.
You see, it sounds very good what you're promising. It sounds very candid. It sounds like, you know, you're very keen to point out what you want to change in the future. But people will be wondering, where has this been over the last 14 years that the SNP has been in power, when there's been a 160% rise in drug deaths and a 55% cut in real terms funding for alcohol and drug services? Is it too late?
Look, we didn't get it right. It's not because we didn't care. It's not because we weren't trying to do things. But, you know, we have concluded, because I don't think we can do anything else, that we haven't got it right. Now, I could sit here and I could try to set out some of the reasons why Scotland may have a higher number of drugs deaths than other countries, reasons that go back many decades in some respects to having higher drug use in the days when I was growing up, an older drug using population with multiple morbidities. I could say all of that, and some of that would be legitimate and be part of the explanation. But I'm choosing instead to say we haven't done well enough here. We haven't yet implemented the policies that have turned this around. So we're going to redouble our efforts. We're going to try different things. Now, I could also sit here and say that aspects of the levers over this are reserved. So the classification of drugs, whether or not we can have safe consumption rooms, which is something most experts in Scotland want to see. The levers of control of these things still lie with Westminster. We don't have all of the levers in our own hands. Now, I could say all of that, and all of that would have some legitimacy, but I'm actually choosing instead to take responsibility for not having done well enough and for setting out in great detail what we're going to do to put it right, I hope, in future.
I've been keen, in the interview to look back at your record in government, because it really matters, because you're effectively asking the Scottish people to trust you to lead an independent Scotland. So it really matters. You're clearly an exceptional communicator. You're clearly somebody who has strong approval ratings relative to other politicians. But if you look at the facts, record drug deaths after 14 years of an SNP government, still inequalities in education, although you admit that in some areas there's been improvement, there are still big inequalities when it comes to education. The highest rate of care home resident deaths from COVID in the UK. Why should people trust you to lead an independent Scotland?
Sorry, Sophie. The number of care home deaths in Scotland is far too high, and it shouldn't be a statistical competition. but I really do have to challenge that. The number of excess deaths in care homes in England has been much higher than in Scotland, or higher than in Scotland. In Scotland, we have recorded more of them as COVID deaths. So I will challenge that, but that is not saying that it is not the case that the number of COVID deaths in care homes, the number of COVID deaths overall, hasn't been too high, because it has been. Look, people will decide whether they trust me or not. That's what elections are all about. I'll put my record in front of the people of Scotland. I'll point to all of the things we have done over the past term of Parliament. We have established a new social security system in Scotland. We've established a Scottish child payment, which is lifting children out of poverty. The level of child poverty too high, but lower in Scotland than in any other part of the UK. We have made progress in closing the attainment gap. We've led the country through the COVID pandemic. I'll also be candid with people, because I think it's better to do that than the opposite, about where I think we haven't got things right, or where we have more work to do. And then people will make a judgment about who they trust most to lead the country through COVID, to get us into recovery. And we've put before the Scottish people a bold, ambitious, transformative programme for recovery from COVID. And then after COVID, when the time is right, to decide the future of Scotland, whether we should leave big decisions in the hands of politicians like Boris Johnson, or whether we should take those decisions into our own hands as an independent country, so that we can shape the long-term future of Scotland in the way we want it to be. And people will make their judgments about that. They'll look at me, my record, what I offer people, and they'll look at the opposition and the competition as well, and they'll cast their verdict on May the 6th. Okay. That's democracy, and I embrace it thoroughly.
Alex Salmond has launched a new party to help build a supermajority for Scottish independence. You must be very grateful for his help.
Look, he can speak for himself. We need a simple majority in the Scottish Parliament to give us the mandate for an independence referendum. And then, of course, we need a majority of the Scottish people to win independence. And, you know, when I listen to people who talk about supermajorities, they sound as if they think we can just bulldoze our way to independence, which is almost contemptuous towards those that we need to persuade.
Many people across Alex Salmond's been acting then?
I listen to the rhetoric around independence, and it seems to skip over the need to do the hard work of persuading those who voted no in 2014, many of whom are now open-minded. I know many of these people, but want to be persuaded and want to be treated with respect, and want us to make a convincing, persuasive case to them. And that's the hard work that I've been doing. Polling for independence is at a higher level now than it's ever been. But we've got to continue with that hard work, with that respectful discourse, and that's how we win independence. And, you know, I'm not particularly interested in an arm wrestling contest with other people about who supports independence the most. That's a conversation with ourselves. I'm interested in persuading those who are open-minded but need still to be persuaded, so that we build a majority for independence that then expresses itself in a legitimate process, because that's how we win independence, and that's what I want to do.
In the spirit of respectful discourse, if Alba does win seats at the election, would you work with Alex Salmond?
No, I'm not going to work with Alex Salmond. Firstly, I have concerns about his personal conduct that he hasn't acknowledged or apologised for. As I've just said, I don't agree with the approach to independence, because I think it is more, or it is risking putting people off rather than bringing people towards us. There's no shortcut to independence. We've got to do it through winning a majority and allowing that majority to express itself in a legitimate process. I also don't know what Alba stands for. For me, independence is not an end in itself. It's a means to a better Scotland, a fair, equal Scotland, where we value everybody who lives here for who they are. And I don't know what Alba stands for, but from what I've seen so far, I probably would have some concerns about that.
OK. Just finally, we talked a lot about lobbying on the programme this morning. The SNP Minister Fergus Ewing had a dinner with Lex Greensill and Sanjeev Gupta in 2017. This is according to the Sunday Mail. No officials were there, no notes were taken. If there's no record of what happened, how do we know it's above board?
Well, it was recorded in the usual way in the register of meetings. Look, I understand the temptation to draw an analogy between the scandal that we see developing around David Cameron, around the UK government, and the Scottish government's dealing with GFG. The two things are very different. We work directly with GFG to firstly save the DL Steelworks. In 2015, there was virtually nobody employed there. Today, it employs more than 100 people. And secondly, with that company to save the Lochaber aluminium smelter, and there's more than 100 jobs have been protected there, with more created as a result. The guarantee that was agreed to support that takeover of the smelter, the committee of the Scottish Parliament approved that. So it's not the lobbying scandal that we see elsewhere, and I think people should be careful in trying to draw that analogy. All the proper due diligence has been done. Things like the way in which Greensill has tried to use the NHS, which David Cameron allegedly lobbied for, that's not happened in Scotland, and we've not had some of the stuff around COVID loans. So I can see the temptation, but the two things are not the same.
OK, Nicola Sturgeon, thank you very much for being on the programme today. Thank you. Quick reminder before we go, do check out the Sophy Ridge on Sunday podcast. We're talking about that interview with Nicola Sturgeon. It will be available from lunchtime on the Sky News app or wherever you usually listen to your podcasts. After this break, it's Sophy Ridge The Take, where we can go over everything we just heard from our interviews. Don't go anywhere.